Sorry, my phone rang. So anyhow, had window visits with my mother, and that was it. Monday came, and Dad was still asking to see people. And so I basically started hounding the phone lines. How can I get in to see him? How can I get him to see him? And so thankfully I was able to get a hold of a charge nurse at Mercy who had some compassion. And I was able to go see him from the window again, still not able to get physically into the room. The look on his face, the joy, the excitement, you could tell that he just needed human interaction from those he loved. So fast forward to Wednesday. Now during this time, my dad is gradually going downhill. We know at this point that he's fighting a big, huge battle. And if he was going to walk out of that hospital, it was going to be weeks on end probably. And so Wednesday came, and I feel like my dad just knew that he wasn't going to get any better. So by this time he had called me and of course told me goodbye. He had told my husband goodbye. He started telling his friends goodbye. And we got to a point where we couldn't even talk to him really, because just it drained his oxygen so much. And so we had resorted to texting. That day I texted him. I said, Dad, I love you. You don't have to reply. Just want to let you know I'm thinking about you. And his reply was, I'm just so tired. I'm sleepy. And I just need my rest. And that was the last cognitive message I got from my father. My husband that day, I called him immediately because the nurse had called and said, we are having your dad sign the paperwork to go on an event sometime, if need be, pretty soon, because his oxygen levels just are not doing any good. So I called my husband. I was at school that day. I called my husband and told him what was going on. And at this point, my dad had just been asking, I want to see Michael. I want to see Michael. I need to talk to Michael. Of course, remember, Michael and my father shared a safe. Michael and my father, they had a lot of conversations, what my dad's friend calls windshield time. Just a lot of heartfelt conversations. And so my husband, I called him and I said, Michael, do whatever it takes. Don't get arrested, but get up and see Dad. He needs to see you. So he gets up to the hospital room. And my dad, who's usually a pretty calm, cool, collected guy, was visibly agitated. At this point, he had been on and off again, the BiPAP to the regular oxygen flow, BiPAP, oxygen flow, this back and forth, back and forth. The previous day, he had just gone to the regular oxygen flow, so things, looked like visibly that they were on the rise, so he was doing better. But that morning, of course, his nurse had him sign the paperwork for the vent, and so he was already upset, emotionally upset. And then while my husband was there, the nurse, eventually he was able to push through and get through to a charge nurse. The charge nurse let him up just because my husband was very persistent with the situation. And so anyhow, my husband got up there and he could tell my dad was very, very agitated. And so he talked to my dad and everything, but my dad was also waving at him and smiling and just doing this kind of thing, just happy to see somebody he loved. Well, throughout this conversation, my dad asked for his glasses. Well, my dad at this point was on a full BiPAP, which is, if you don't know, a BiPAP machine, it covers pretty much your whole face. And the nurse kind of angrily told him, you can't have your glasses. It doesn't fit on your machine. Well, that agitated my dad because, he was 67, 68 years old. Of course, was having problems seeing. So anyhow, he got past that, but he was agitated with the nurse for telling him no. Well, a couple of seconds later, he asked the nurse to hand him his bag of stuff. So the nurse handed him his bag of stuff, and he reached in his bag and he got his wallet out. He wanted to give my husband his wallet. Inside the wallet had like passcodes to different things. It had information that my husband needed to know, but also my dad was very safety conscientious, and he wanted to make sure that if he went on an event and he lost control of his bodily functions and he lost control of his mind because he was medically induced in a coma, then he didn't have to worry about things like credit cards and debit cards and things like that being with people he didn't know. So the nurse, when he tried to get the nurse to hand the wallet off to my husband, she became very agitated and very angry with my father. No, he can't have that. He can't have that. That's cross-contamination and everything. So my father was on speakerphone at this time, and my husband heard this conversation. He told the nurse, just put it in a bag and I won't even open it here at the hospital. I'll open it when I get home. Remember, we've already had COVID. Remember, supposedly in their minds, logically, CDC, we can't have contamination for 90 days, right? So anyhow, she finally goes out and talks to the charge nurse. The charge nurse says, just wipe it down with Lysol wipe and let him have it. So the nurse did that. She was agitated. But during this time, my husband's watching my dad's oxygen flow decrease. Earlier in the day, my dad was on 100% just the nasal cranial oxygen support, which is better than the BiPAP. But throughout the day of this nurse, he had to go back on the BiPAP, and it started off at 60% oxygen flows or support, and it gradually, under her care, went up to 100% support just because of her personality. So anyhow, of course, we're still not able to get in and see my father. Fast forward to later that evening, I get a call from the doctor as on my way from church, and it was the doctor telling me that my dad's kidneys had started shutting down, and they're going to have to put him on a vent. So again, these calls just happen to always come while I'm driving, and so I'm not even sure how I got home that night, but I tell the doctor, hold on, I've got to get my mom on the phone. And we call and add my husband to the phone. Again, remembering that I'm still the POA. I'm still the one having to make these decisions for my father at this point. And so we ask some questions, and we give our blessing to go ahead and put him on the vent. Within a few hours, he was fully vented. His body had started rejecting the vent, so they actually had to end up medically paralyzing him. He couldn't feel any movement. He couldn't feel anything at that point. The next day, this would have been Thursday the 4th, he had a really hard day. Oxygen levels just were not increasing. It was gradually decreasing. The dialysis, he was on 24-hour round-the-clock dialysis at this point, and his numbers were, the acidicness in his blood was going up. Everything was going up and nothing was going down. Nothing was working. Friday came, and my dad flatlined. One of my nurse friends, my mom actually, let me back up. My mom was discharged from the TCU that day, and as soon as my mom, literally we got her out of the car and we headed straight up to the hospital. And I'd finally got permission to be able to come in and do window visits with my dad. He is not cognitive at this point. Start pushing enough buttons and come to find out my dad should have been released from quarantine on the Wednesday that my husband was there. The very day that we could have went in and seen my dad, the very day that he needed that support because he had a nurse that was not very caring and compassionate, was the very day that we were denied access to get in there. It was also the very day that my dad should have been released from quarantine to have family visits. So my dad had went a full 48 hours without being able to see his family because somebody in Mercy Hospital did not do their job on the timeline. So Friday, I'm able to get my mother in there. She's still not able to get in the room because they're still having to get infectious disease department to sign off on the timeline to sign off that he can have inside visitors. So my mother had a window visit at noon on Friday. About 4:30, 5 o'clock that afternoon, I get a phone call from the nurse's station saying that Dad's not doing good. They've had to increase his blood pressure medicine, not because his blood pressure was out of control, but to keep his heart beating. My dad had flatlined. Thankfully, one of my friends was working at nurse's station that day. It wasn't his nurse, but she was directly outside his window. And when he flatlined, the nurses, of course, ran in there, doctors, whoever is on that team. And my friend just kept saying, we can't stop. And she was able to keep them going when he probably shouldn't have been able to stay alive. But she bought us a few hours. About 7:30 that night, after changing nurses, or maybe it was right around that time, I get a phone call. It was evening nurse. Yeah, it was evening nurse. So right at 7:30, I get a phone call from the nurse saying Dad's not doing any good. They actually had to add another medicine to him at this point. So he's on 4 medications just to keep his blood flowing through his body at this point, saying that it wasn't looking good and that I should expect a phone call from the doctor pretty soon. So that was like 7:30, 8 o'clock. She called again at 9 with another update saying he wasn't doing any good and to keep my phone close. 10 o'clock, the doctor called and said that Dad was now speaking for himself, that the DNR was now in place, and that she was afraid of him going into cardiac arrest, and that we needed to get there as soon as we could. And that Dad had said in his living will that he did not want to be resuscitated no matter what. So we called everybody that needed to get up there. We rushed up to the hospital. We were there by 11:45, somewhere in there. And by 2:17 that night, we had lost my father. The only thing that he asked for in this whole process was for family support. The only thing he wanted was for those he loved to be able to come in and hold his hand, to give him a hug, to give him a kiss. The last time I physically touched my father, not when he was in the ER, the last time I gave him a hug when he was still conscious, but the last time I physically touched my father was when he was cold. His body heat had started actually going down. He was not aware. He couldn't even feel my touch. He was in a medically induced coma. He was in a medically induced paralysis. He didn't even know we were there. He died in a cold hospital room with his family and friends around him, but without the touch of those family and friends, without knowing that touch of family and friends. It was a peaceful transition to heaven for him. He died with a smile on his face. In Mercy, the nurses, for the most part, were great, with the exception of that one. And by the way, I did file a formal complaint against her. But these regulations have got to stop. On day one, when my dad was admitted to the hospital, I immediately called Eric Burleson. My words to him was, I know there's nothing that can be done right now to get me in to see my father. I know that you cannot do anything to get me in to see my father, but something has to be done, because these hospitals are not going to change without legislation. These hospitals are not going to let up because now they have control without being told that they have to do it and without their arms being forced to do it. Did not make any logical sense for me not to be allowed in my dad's hospital room. It did not make any logical sense for my husband not to be allowed in my dad's hospital room on the very day that we should have been let out. But because of a paperwork issue, we were denied that access. We all had positive COVID test results saved on our phones to prove to these medical officials that we were okay. Based on CDC guidelines and CDC restrictions, it made no logical sense. We could not get it. We could not give it. Matter of fact, of course we don't know, but matter of fact,